Well, to the misfortune of all of you, let's talk some Chiefs, guys. Welcome to the Chief of the North with RGR Football. I'm Seth Kaiser, the Chief of the North, Minnesota Chiefs fan, whatever it is you call me, the guy who wears black too much because it's easier than working out. Whatever you say, it's probably true. Every Thursday, just like we do every Thursday. Yeah, it made sense. I'm here to talk some Chiefs with you guys, and there's a lot going on. So I'm going to try to just roll right into it. I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the Final 53, a couple things that surprised me, a couple things that didn't, a few maybe newish updates with the Chris Jones situation, and maybe a little bit of a procedural change on how we're going to do things this football season here in the Chief of the North. So that we'll start with that, okay? What you've gotten used to is me recording this and it publishing usually on Thursdays. During this season, Ryan and I have had a conversation about what would look best, what would work best for you guys, and what would work best for me, if I'm being perfectly honest. And we are going to be moving to Tuesday recordings for this, so we can get to you guys a little earlier in the week. We can talk about some of the things that I saw in the game that I think are important. It'll vary a little bit, but very little. For the most part, I've had a few of you ask, those of you that have seen maybe some other announcements elsewhere and that kind of stuff, whether or not I'm still going to be here with RGR Football. I am. You're not going to get rid of me that easily. And so every Tuesday is when I'm going to be coming at you, starting with this next Tuesday. We're going to be just basically kind of doing some takeaways from the most recent game. Now, this Tuesday, obviously, there won't be a game to talk about, but I have a feeling we'll have enough things to talk about as it is, which brings me to all the things. Oh, so seriously, do the YouTube stuff. Hit like, hit subscribe. I'd say leave reviews, but I think that's a podcast thing. It's hard to say, but maybe do that anyway if you have an option. But let's talk about some things that have changed since the last time we had an opportunity to do this. The first thing, and I'm just going to pull it up right here in front of me, the Chiefs have their quote-unquote Final 53 that's on the roster now. That's going to be subject to some change. So they released their initial, quote unquote, Final 53 almost after every single other team, other than I think the Ravens and the Rams, because teams love to release things late because they think it gives them some kind of weird tactical advantage or something. I don't know. But that Final 53 has already changed because the Chiefs did make one waiver claim, cornerback Darius Rush from the Colts. It's one that actually I really like. Exceptional athlete with I think he's like 6'2", about 200 pounds, tons of length. That's just the kind of guy that we've seen Brett Veach go after. We've seen Steve Spagnuolo turn into competent corners. It's just kind of an interesting thing. What I told someone, if there was one thing about the Steve Spagnuolo and Brett Veach combination that I would bet my life on, it would be their ability to pick out young corners. So I'm thinking that's pretty exciting. I'm happy to see that. We'll see how it goes. But it's just an example of how you hear Final 53, but it's not really the Final 53. It's more of a sort of Final 53. So here's what we're looking at. I was just going to go through a few of the surprises that we have on there. And I know that you're going to get a lot of conversation about this from guys smarter than me like Ryan and Dan. But the biggest thing that I think intrigued a lot of people is that Gabbert, he won the backup job, which I think a lot of people saw coming. But the fact that they didn't even keep Shane Buechele on the practice squad, he actually, just before I started recording, it was announced that he was signed by the Bills, which to me is kind of a we must learn your offense kind of move. But I don't think that's going to move the needle one way or another for them. If that was going to help teams stop Andy Reid's offense by now, it would have happened. So I think the Chiefs were almost always going to go with Blaine Gabbert. I do think Shane Buechele played his way into making the conversation at least somewhat interesting. However, I don't think he always had an uphill battle. He always was going to have to not just perform well, but he was going to have to outperform Blaine Gabbert in order to win that spot, and he didn't. So that's where we're at with that. It's just kind of interesting to me, though, that they decided not to even keep him around on the practice squad. The running back position, Pirine, a guy that I really pushed for to make the final roster, did not, but he's back on the practice squad. So your running backs are Isaiah Pacheco, Jarrett McKinnon, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. There's going to be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth with regards to Clyde Edwards-Helaire being on the roster. The team likes him more than the fan base does at this point, and that's just it never made a lot of sense for them to cut him because of financial purposes. So one of the most interesting things that I think about this roster this year is the fact that they finally went with 7 wide receivers. That's something that Andy Reid usually doesn't do. I want to talk about that, but first, a reminder about something. Ooh, I kind of almost did a professional segue there, but then I interrupted myself. So we are going to get to your mailbag questions in just a minute. There are a couple of them from last week, and I did just want to say going back to purely mailbag questions and that kind of stuff is something that I'm really interested in doing once we get started on these Tuesdays. So I'll be reminding you guys, put mailbag questions down there, especially for this next Tuesday, because we're not going to have a game between now and then. So again, mailbag questions in the comments, put question marks before it. I'll probably look at a couple of comments that I think are at least interesting. But that's where you put your mailbag questions. They'll get priority. Sometimes I'll tweet about it. Sometimes I won't. It's hard to say what I might do. Anyway, about the wide receiver positions. I don't think there were any surprises there from people that watched the Chiefs throughout the preseason. And so you've got MVS, Tony, Moore, Rice, James, Ross, and Watson. Now, even though I said them in that order, it would not surprise me if Justin Watson got a pretty fair number of snaps. Yesterday at Brett Veach's presser, which we'll talk about in a minute with regards to Chris Jones, he made some interesting comments about Rice and Ross being more kind of niche guys at first, kind of having some special packages for them, and then hopefully they'll get more involved in the offense. That shouldn't surprise anyone. That has been the Andy Reid plan for wide receivers for as long as he's been with the Chiefs, and honestly with the Eagles before that. He gets young wide receivers involved with certain things, quick throws, tunnel screens, just certain package plays early on, and then he tries to fold them more and more into the offense. I always remind people, now he was an incredibly raw receiver coming out of college, but even Tyreek Hill, one of the most physically gifted athletes to ever play in the NFL, he started off as a gadget guy. And that's how all these guys are going to start off. That's what the role they mostly had Sky Moore in last year, gadget guy, and just basically running clear routes to create space for other people. That's what you're going to see from Rice and Ross, unless they force their way onto the field. We'll see how it goes. Obviously, Rashee Rice, he's had some drops issues in preseason. Quite a few. The last preseason game was rough. Of course, everyone, noticed the wide open walk-in touchdown where he clearly overthought that it was coming. Don't drop it. Don't drop it. Don't drop it. I've never been this open in my life. Boom, drops it. Rice had good hands in college. I'm not too worried about it. I think they'll get back to him. I don't think he's got the yips or anything like that. We're just going to get a chance to see how short his memory is. And that's going to be a big deal for him as a player to just kind of overcome that little bit of adversity early. Kind of glad it's happening now, to be perfectly honest. I just thought of something in terms of the height of my camera. And we're going to ignore it. So my wife was making fun of me last night, actually, when she was watching it. She said, Seth, do you know where to put the camera? And I said, no, I don't. It's just on top of my computer. So I look forward to the comments below about that, giving me suggestions on how I should do it. Anyway, so with Rashee Rice, the interesting thing for me is that he did show a lot of juice after the catch in terms of not just being able to make guys miss, but being able to shake off arm tackles. The line that you always hear for receivers is, well, he's like a running back once he has the ball in his hands. That's usually not true, but for some guys, it looks pretty true, and Rice is one of them. So I think he could do very well in that niche role and kind of expand his role in the offense as he builds confidence. Justin Ross, my assumption is they're going to do some red zone stuff. They're going to let him run some boundary stuff, kind of see what he does with some go up and get him balls early on. And he's going to have a chance to expand that role as well. That leaves Sky Moore, who, from what Brett Veach said, is ready to take on basically a full-time role in the offense. And I think for all the conversation about, R squared and Rice and Ross, I think Sky Moore is the guy that's probably going to get by far the largest uptick in role this year. And this is going to be the year where we can really see about that second-round pick, about how they decided to do things. Everyone's always going to be comparing him to George Pickens, who's, of course, doing very well in Pittsburgh. but has had a much more of an opportunity as well. So I guess we'll kind of see how that goes. But one thing I do think is that Justyn Ross, of all of them, he's an interesting guy to keep his eye on because he's a guy that really did force his way onto the roster. Which, oh, by the way, how wrong was I, right? We had this hype train on him several years in a row, and I just didn't really think so. But he has forced his way onto the field. And one of the things that I said is that when you're a guy that doesn't have a ton of natural quickness, you've got to win in other ways. And you've got to be higher level in those other ways in order to force your way onto the field. And he's done just that. So good on him. It's such a great story. I hope it just keeps ratcheting up. I can't wait to see what he does next. Those were a couple of the more interesting things in terms of the roster. Another thing is that Caliendo made the roster at the expense of Darian Kennard. That's kind of bottom of the offensive line roster churn, but it's always an interesting thing when you see a guy come in and manage to push out a draft pick that I think they had some pretty high hopes for. I mean, Darian Kennard is a guy that I liked his college film. I thought he had some potential at right tackle or as a guard, and good on Caliendo for kind of being able to force him out. But you see, that's kind of how it goes. The NFL comes at you fast. So those are just a couple of the roster things that I thought were interesting. In terms of on the defensive side of things, there really wasn't anything there. As I look up and down this group, there's really nothing there that's surprising, other than maybe the fact that they traded for Neil Farrell. This is one of my favorite bits, is mispronouncing names. And he's more of a nose tackle type. And so that leaves them with Mike Dana, with Colbert, and Farrell, and then Shelton on the practice squad. That's a lot of nose tackles. And so that's kind of fascinating to me. People keep talking about, well, it's to help shore up the interior defensive line with Chris Jones out. But none of these guys are 3-tech penetrators. And that's because you can't really find those guys in free agency necessarily, or that are available for trade. I mean, I guess you could grab Ndamukong Suh, who at this point in career is a very, very specialized role. He could probably rush a little bit from the 3-tech from the interior, but guys like Farrell and Coburn, those really aren't Chris Jones replacements, and not that you could do that anyway. A Chris Jones replacement is a guy who is more of a rusher from the interior, not this nose tackle, space eating, block eating type guy. So that's kind of interesting to me that they go that route. That would tell me that they're at least trying to figure out what the future of nose tackle looks like. Dana's on a 1-year deal, so we'll kind of see what happens from there. But other than that, there really wasn't anything that should come as a surprise to anyone in terms of the defensive side of the ball, what things looked like. Obviously, Charles Omenihu's suspension starts now. I haven't heard anything about any kind of appeal shortening it. Looks like it will be a 6-game suspension. That's a bummer for the Chiefs. And, of course, we're right back to talking about what we're talking about every week. Lately, it feels like, and that's the Chris Jones holdout. I'm going to do this every time. Oh, nothing new on Twitter. It would be, or X, I don't know. So the long and short of it, we talked a lot about Chris Jones' holdout last week. So I don't really need to delve too much more into it. There are a couple things, people are commenting, well, the Eagles marched up and down the field with Chris Jones on the field. I'm not sure what those comments mean. Like, what's your conclusion then? That he's bad, or that the team doesn't need him? Because, I mean, you can point to that game, and I'd point to a number of things that were going on in that game. But I would also say, well, why are we treating one game as dispositive? It's the Super Bowl, mind you. Fair enough. But if we were just basing on the Super Bowl, they should have really paid Juju Smith-Schuster big money because he was a big part of the second half. You know what I mean? Like, you don't go on a 1-game sample size, and then especially with one defensive player that the entire unit is scheming around. It's kind of an interesting thing to me that you often see that when holdouts start, or when holdouts go for extended amounts of time. You often see people make comments like that about players. And I would just caution you that that's kind of a wrong-headed way of thinking about this. And what you're really trying to do is think of reasons why the player's bad, or reasons why the team might not need him. And I get that, because, you're protecting yourself from the bad thoughts of how it could go poorly. But I saw a few comments like that, and I've seen that on Twitter and that kind of stuff too. And it's interesting to me that people want to use the Super Bowl as a knock on Jones. I would urge them to turn on the film from that game and take a look at what he was doing. But I would also just, go back to every other game prior to that as well. So a couple of questions that we've got from the mailbag. Will I please fill in for Chris Jones till week 8? I really believe you can do it. I would literally die. It would be very, very unfortunate to me, or for me. I don't think Chris Jones holds out till week 8. I talked about that a lot last week. I don't think it makes sense fiscally. I do think there's a possibility that this is about more than money to Jones, that he views it as a respect issue, and that would explain an extended holdout. And for fans, that probably doesn't make sense. Honestly, it doesn't make sense to me. I'm more of a practical guy. I would be viewing it purely in fiscal terms. And so we talked a lot last week about how a protracted holdout leads to affecting the franchise tag next year. And so then in addition to costing him the fine money from this preseason and then his game checks this season, and then also his ability to hit his sack numbers, I think it's like a $1.2 million incentive there. You're talking somewhere anywhere between like 12 to $15 million that costs him. And then that also messes with the franchise tag next year, makes it something like a 22 to 24 million, maybe a little lower instead of like a 33 million. So then you're talking another 9 million there, as well as how that affects negotiations with the team. And that's money that at a certain point you've reached money that you can't get back. Like there's no way that you're going to get a contract with 15 million more guaranteed than what the Chiefs might have been offering. I mean, depending on, again, we don't know the offers yet. So maybe it's just this incredible low ball. I kind of doubt it. But the odds of being able to get back 15, 20 million in guaranteed money are virtually non-existent, especially given the the franchise tag implications for next year. So if he continues to hold out, after week 1, because week 1 is kind of a try to force the team's hand moment. If he does after that, to me, that tells me one of two things. One, he's getting bad advice in terms of the fiscal repercussions. Maybe that's true. I have no idea. I don't know the Katz brothers. I'm sure they're good at what they do, but the fiscal side of it doesn't make sense. Especially when you consider that next year he'd be trying to renegotiate another long-term deal and be another year older, and he's at that weird age where that makes it tough. And the second thing is, for him, it's about more than money. It's about the idea of status and respect from the team and around the league. And players do view their contracts that way. And whether or not that makes sense to us doesn't really matter. That's just how it is. And what's the line I've used on clients a million times is reality does not care if you believe it. It just is what it is. And so for players, that really is like a respect thing. And again, that's something that doesn't matter that much to me, but it might matter a great deal to him. And people are always going to negotiate based on what's important to them. So we'll see what happens with that. I had a couple people, we talked a lot about Jawan Taylor last week. And Clayton Hale commented, of course, Schwartz told you he was the king of that kind of first step. Mitch Schwartz, great example of a guy that managed to get that first step just a split second early. And that's one of the reasons why it was so fun to be able to quote him with regards to talking about Jawan Taylor's first step. Let me just make sure. I had a bunch of people ask about times hours. I would just say, why don't you go ahead and take a look at my Twitter feed? There's a new home for the old times hours crew. I won't get too into it here because, this is RGR football, people. So let me the Journey of Purpose asked, we're going to do a couple mailbag questions and I got to get out of here to the day job. He says, receiving ceiling comps 2 years from now, Rice is better than Megatron, Moore and James to Edelman, Tony to Percy Harvin, Mini Tyreek, and Kelsey to Kelsey, Watson to question mark, Ross, question mark, MVS gone. Great job as usual, Seth. Are red ties illegal in Minnesota? Maybe, it's hard to say. And look, there's red in here. See? Look at that red. The ceiling of the various players. I mean, Rashee Rice, the comp to Megatron is not a good comp. Edelman is kind of interesting with Sky Moore. Moore is a guy, though, he's got a really great catch radius and huge hands. He's got long arms, huge hands. But he's a smaller, shorter guy, probably going to win more out of the slot. Rice, though, I think a better comparison to him is Juju Smith-Schuster. Is his ceiling as a player, I think, is a more vertically explosive Juju. which that's a really, really good player. So that would be a better comparison to me for how he wins and how he succeeds at the NFL level. Justyn Ross is more of like nobody's Megatron or like Andre Johnson, but he's like a similar style player. But no, take away Megatron because I mean the man ran like a 4.2, 4.3 40 at his size. There's no comp for him. But more of like if you take like an Andre Johnson type player, a guy who wins with size, physicality, a DeAndre Hopkins type guy. Although DeAndre Hopkins is smaller, he's just got incredible ball skills. Those are like that's the template, not an actual comparison. Because when you're talking about some of the best guys to ever play that way, but with Justyn Ross, he's more of a pure X, pure boundary guy. Wins with the ball in the air, wins with physicality, has to win with good routes because he's not a quick guy in and out of it. So those pure X type receivers are more the comparisons for him than anyone else. MVS, whether or not he's gone next year, or that's just going to depend on how the guys develop this year. I think he's more important to the offense than people realize. I have very little time left. This was treated as a mailbag question, so I'll answer. Would you rather have a helicopter with infinite gas or a vast series of secret underground tunnels? Does the helicopter come with a pilot? Because if it does, then yeah, helicopter, easy. Because secret underground tunnels, you still got to walk through those things or maybe drive through them. And that would just take a long time. All right, that's the time I have for you guys. Remember, Tuesdays from here on out, Chief of the North, RGR football. We're going to have a lot of fun this season. I appreciate each and every one of you. I appreciate all the kind words about when times are ceased. And I'm excited for the next chapter, both with RGR football and everything else that we've got going on. Thanks again for watching. You know what? It's a good week to be a Chiefs fan.